Okay, thanks for that introduction. And I guess thanks for mentioning the fonts. One thing I want to note about that font is it's free to download. It's called Bell Topo Songs, and it might be in some of these slides, and you can download it for free at my website at sarahbellmaps.com. So yes, good morning, everybody. I am one of you. I live in the Pacific Northwest in Bellingham, Washington, and it's an honor to be your keynote speaker and to be part of this great event. It's my first time participating in the Northwest GIS User Conference, and I'm really excited to know that there's a group like this convening in our great Northwest region. And I want to thank Randy Bonds for this invitation. I was really honored. And thank you to all the organizers of this event. I know that these events take a lot of work to do, especially when they're virtual these days. So I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So yes, my name is Sarah Bell. I'm a cartographer and a data viz designer at Esri. And today I'm speaking to you all. And as I was waiting for this meeting to start, I was looking through all the people in the WOVA app, and you are all a group of highly accomplished GIS professionals. You all live in the Northwest or nearby, which is the region of the world that I love and call home. I know some of you personally, and I have even worked with a few of you in one way or another. And it's an honor to speak with all of you today. So in order to decide what to cover for this talk, I considered you all as the audience. And I also dug into my own experiences as a map maker. And I've considered some things that I've learned along the way in this world of GIS and cartography. And I also considered some current conversations in cartography and map making. And you're also going to hear about our common interest of the Northwest peppered throughout this talk, because ultimately I wanted this to be a presentation that's relevant to all of you. So in the next 30 to 35 minutes or so, you're going to hear me talk about bias and map making. I'm also going to discuss the line between GIS and cartography, or if there is one. And I'm also going to close by talking about the power of maps. So here are some key takeaways that I'm hoping that you all consider. Every part of what makes a map possible has potential biases, and these biases can have implications for the world. And number two, map making is a holistic process, from the idea to even collect data to the way we publish a map. And number three, when we account for our biases and assumptions about the map making process, we can create maps that empower others. So I'm a cartographer, a data viz designer, a cartography textbook author, a lead product engineer, a video tutorial author, and a presenter. And these are the things about me that you might find out if you stumble into a tutorial I've written or my LinkedIn or Twitter profile. But what gets lost in the lens or in the titles of all the person is the lens through which that person acts within those titles. So I wanted to give you a little history on me, just to give you an idea where some of my perspective comes from. Of course, this can't capture everybody's perspective, but here's just a list of some my history of how I got here. After my undergraduate studies at Western Washington University, I was fortunate to be hired as a park ranger for the North Cascades National Park, where I worked seasonally. And this was a very big part of my cartography trajectory, because most park ranger positions are seasonal. And I started wondering how I could make a national park work a permanent full-time job. And at the North Cascades National Park, there were a lot of park scientists. They were working as geologists, social scientists, biologists, and they were all using this thing called GIS. And I thought, if GIS can get me a permanent job at a national park, I should learn it. And serendipitously, my partner was studying for his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time. So I decided to enroll in UW-Madison's postgraduate GIS certificate program. And while I was there, I also took some cartography classes. And that is the moment that I knew I was supposed to be a cartographer. And upon receiving my GIS certificate, we moved back to Bellingham, and I began working as a professional cartographer at Colshan Cartographic. And while I was there, I used a lot of GIS tools to make maps for the National Park Service, the Forest Service, Green Trails, and other map agencies and map companies. And I also used a lot of Adobe Illustrator, and I really enjoyed this job, but I was still seeking some more formal education in geography. So I enrolled in Western Washington University's Master of Science in Geography program. And upon graduating, I was hired at Esri, where I have been since December of 2013. Okay, so a little bit about what I do at Esri. My first year at Esri, I helped start the Professional Services Cartography Lab. I worked on the cartography for mapping projects of all different kinds, ranging from data viz, color choices, point symbology creation, logistical mapping, environmental and conservation causes, and many, many more different projects. And I eventually got pulled into a software prototype that was a mapping plugin for Adobe Illustrator. And now I'm fully on that team. And the product is now known as ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. And I recently released a book about this, which is full of tutorials. But perhaps like many of you, I enjoy making maps all the time. I don't just create them for work, I even create them for fun. I'm always thinking about mapping. It's a marvelous way to be both scientific and creative. So I just want to also point out that all of these maps were made using Esri's technology, and the 4 maps on this screen that are not animated were all made with Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. So throughout my years of map making, my understanding of what we are doing has broadened rather than become more restrictive. And I want to share what I mean. So I want to discuss how I'm using some commonly used terms in our field. And the first one is cartography. The common definition of cartography is the science and art of map making, or something along those lines. So instead of taking this definition of face value, I want to unpack it for a moment. Because to me, this definition implies that only maps that are made that are artistic and that follow a certain science are actual cartography. So for the duration of this talk, I'm inviting you all to first consider cartography and map making as one and the same, at least for the duration of this talk. And I want to do something a little bold for this talk and take away the art and science of. And this might be confusing to hear a professional cartographer ask you to abandon these qualifiers. And I hope the reason becomes clear in a few moments. The next word I want to explore is the word map. So everyone knows what a map is, right? So here's what I get when I go on Google Images and do a Google image search of map. I get a lot of nominally symbolized polygon administrative areas like states and countries. So these are all maps, right? These are very much like the maps we learned from as kids. But map means much more than what our immediate judgment tells us that it means. If you look up the definition of map, there are multiple meanings. The idea of what a map is becomes broader with each definition. So with each definition, they could be something like anything on this page. Maps are wonderful tools for understanding the arrangement of spatial data, and I don't think we can overstate how lucky we are to be part of this field. But map is also a verb. So these are further definitions from an online dictionary. Let's look at these. Okay, so because I think these final 3, we do a lot of this in our daily work, and we sometimes take it for granted. Each of these last 3 definitions uses the word associate. Mapping as a verb is associating things with other things. That's very cool, and it's very powerful. So in the geospatial context, people are mapping. We are collecting data, putting data into associative groups, delineating the data into a spatial database. We then analyze how these data or groups of data are associated with things or other groups of things. Then we put this onto maps, either digitally or in print. And we aren't mapping just for the heck of it. We're either driven to make maps because mapping is fun, or it's exciting and it's important. Mapping gives meaning to our world. People, like many of you here today, are giving associative context to spatial phenomenon so that we can gain a better understanding of that phenomenon. And I can't think of a cooler job than that. So keeping that in mind, that mapping is as much a verb as it is the product, for the duration of this talk, I'm inviting you all to broaden the definition of cartography to mean the contextualization of geographic space for ours and others' understanding of that space. And with this definition, cartography can be very broad. It can be any way that any human ascribes meaningful associations to geography. So cartography in this definition can mean the way that you describe directions to your house, or it can be the way that a series of news articles refers to the different neighborhoods in your city. So I want to give an example, personal anecdote. Last year, I was a judge for a cartography competition, and one of the entries was a short story about a person's usual walk that they used to take with their now deceased dog. And this was the only submission of its kind. Every other map that we typically think of, every other map was what we typically think of when we picture a map. And so this short story was a spatial love letter to the dog that the person was missing. They vividly described the areas where they would walk, so readers had a clear vision of the literary cartography. All of these things that we humans do to spatially contextualize stories and data is, in a sense, iterating and reiterating how people perceive the world, and in turn informs society how to treat the world. So I'm pulling way back from strict textbook definitions here to define cartography as any way in which we humans contextualize space in which we live, or even space that we don't live. And it's totally okay if you abandon this definition when we're done. I think the most important thing here is that whether you're using the strict definition or this broader definition, when we make maps, we are contextualizing space for ours and others' understanding of that space. So why do I want to broaden the definition for this talk? Professional map makers like you all are the experts. You're making maps that people trust. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the power that everyone has to give meaning and contextualization to Earth's geography. For example, my sister will probably never become a professional map maker, but she is certainly skilled at telling me how her hometown of Chelan, Washington changes from summer to winter. I have a temporal cartographic story of a city that goes from a major tourist attraction seasonally. So as we associate meaning to our geography, we do so with bias. And over the years, the term bias has gained a negative reputation. But bias as a concept is neither positive nor negative. Bias itself on its own is a neutral term that encompasses the idea that we make really quick evaluations based upon experience or our instinct, our past successes, things that have worked for us, and sometimes we do so with very little knowledge. We have evolved to do this for the purpose of survival and longevity. So social justice activist and author of Everyday Bias, Howard J. Ross is considered a leader in identifying and addressing bias. And while being interviewed for the Joy Carden show, Howard Ross stated that we have created this sort of bias equals badness equation. We hear the word bias and we say it's bad or it's wrong. And in reality, bias can be bad or wrong, but it can also be tremendously helpful. So we're going to use the lovely world of bats to illustrate how some biases can help us. And by the way, did you know that bats occur in all 50 US states? So this might seem like common knowledge to you, but when I was a park ranger at the North Cascades National Park, I got to share my love of bats with park visitors. And not many people ponder the existence of bats being everywhere in the US. And also, side note, for anyone interested, there is an annual event held on Twitter and Instagram, and it's called the 30-Day Map Challenge. It's coming up soon. Every day in November, there will be a different topic to map, and people like you are encouraged to be creative with the topic. And this was my entry for November 19th of last year, when the daily topic was null. So bats use echolocation to identify their prey. And I know a lot of you know this, but it's gonna have a point. I used to share this a lot at the North Cascades National Park. So bats make this noise that's inaudible to most humans, and from the sound waves that bounce off the objects, bats can identify if the object is food or even maybe a threat. And bats are really great at this. So they can even identify prey from a partial read. So like, for example, in this graphic, if they get sound waves from this moth's wing, it might be enough information to identify that as a moth and then have a snack. So I'm gonna see if you all can do this too. I don't know if you have access to the chat, so you can type it in or just think the answers to yourselves. But I'm gonna share just partial images of words and ask if you guys, if you all can know what it says. So ready? Give you a few moments. See if you know what it says. If you guessed North Cascades, congratulations, you're correct. All right, so I know these are pretty easy, but I have one more in the slide, so we might as well do it. Ready? Your quick guesses on what this says. Okay, so I'm guessing that some of you thought this was going to be National Park, and that would have been a safe bet based upon how many times I have uttered the phrase National Park in this talk so far. Also, the previous slide was North Cascades. And the phrase National Park is one that commonly follows North Cascades in this region of the world. And sometimes bats get it wrong too. They will use their past experiences of success or things that have worked for them to capture food and avoid predators. And sometimes they'll accidentally die for something that wasn't food, like maybe a leaf falling from a tree or something like that. And we all have these biases. They are based on our experiences, our preferences, our instincts, and whatever. So in the previous slide, when we all thought the hidden phrase was North Cascades, our biases served us well. And in this slide, for some people, the biases might have steered us into incorrect assumptions. Because we have been accustomed to think of bias as intentional or unintentional harm, we oftentimes have this gut reaction to claim that we don't have biases or that we've considered them thoroughly in order to weed them out of our maps. With these two examples that I just shared, I just wanted to establish that everyone has biases, and sometimes they serve us well, and other times they lead us into incorrect and perhaps harmful findings. So in the world of maps and geospatial, we can better serve our contextualization of space if we acknowledge this existence of biases. Whenever we make maps for work or fun or any other reason, we decide, or a group of us decides, what should be on the final product and what should be omitted. If we added representations of all that existed in the extent of our maps, they would be illegible 100% of the time. And this is bias on behalf of the map makers. Bias has been a part of maps, every map, since the beginning of mapping, before cartography was even a word. And maps are usually accepted as truth. They're these facts on a page or a screen showing us where things occur on our planet. Maps are used in courtrooms to establish land ownership boundaries. Maps are shared over social media to prove certain points. In fact, maps have been one of the most significant ways to communicate information about the current pandemic that we're in. And these spatial documents called maps are taken as unbiased facts by most people in the world. And since maps are usually accepted as these unbiased facts, map makers' roles, at least by most people in the world, are seen as indifferent sort of liberators of spatial facts. So I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge my own bias. These are two maps I made for a mock-up of news articles on the Wenatchee Marathon. And please note that these are not official marathon maps. The map on the left shows a box. It's a smaller scale map. It shows a box around the city of Wenatchee, Washington. So if I were in the actual room with you, I'd ask all the Washingtonians for a show of hands if your hometown is labeled on this map. I mean, maybe take a moment in the chat to say yes or no if you live in Washington. Did I label your hometown? I would suspect, I could be wrong, but I could suspect that most of you would not have your hands raised. The map on the left cannot show all the towns in Washington because if I did that, the map would not serve its intended purpose. Remember, bias itself is not good or bad as a concept, but it is something that we need to consider when we read maps and make maps. And this is essentially at the root of critical cartography. We basically use our critical thinking skills to understand the bias in our maps so that we can better understand the map subject or even the unmapped subject. So let's talk about the map on the right. It shows it's a larger scale map. Now we're zoomed into Wenatchee. It shows the Wenatchee Marathon route. And again, I only show a few streets in Wenatchee and East Wenatchee to basically orient map readers. This is not a map for directions from the Wenatchee Safeway to the Wenatchee YMCA, even though those two locations are within this map's extent. I did not mark those locations because I was very biased about what I wanted to include. I don't have any bad intentions and I'm not trying to trick people with this map. I'm just making cartographic choices on what to display so that people are interested who are interested in viewing the marathon can orient themselves with the route and possible parking areas. But bias also exists in the map reader. For example, for spectators, the map on the right might serve as a tool for deciding where to park or watch their friends compete in the Wenatchee Marathon. And for athletes running in the marathon, the map might serve as a tool for practicing different sections of the route. I don't know about you all, but I like to run, and I have never run a marathon, but I like to know the route of the races that I do. Or if you're a resident of Wenatchee, this map might help you decide which parts of town to avoid on race day. It's unavoidable. Each of us has a different perspective, and we all read maps based upon this perspective. And this is the bias of the map reader. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to jump to a personal anecdote that happened to me very early in my map making career. And this experience ultimately helped me, at least in part, realize that as a map maker, I'm not an unbiased spatial fact teller, but rather I have motivations that bias the outcome of the maps that I make. So this building that I'm showing right here is Science Hall on the University of Wisconsin-Madison's campus, where the geography department is housed. Most of my GIS cartography classes at Wisconsin were taught to me in this building. So it is in this building where myself and 3 of my fellow classmates formulated our final class project for our interactive cartography course. And even though I was living in Wisconsin, I was still hyper obsessed with the Pacific Northwest and climbing. So I was somehow able to convince the other 3 people in my group that we should map something pertaining to Washington State and mountains. So we mapped Mount Rainier's climbing incidents. So map makers cannot make maps without data. For our project, Mount Rainier climbing incidents, we used the well-respected The Challenge of Rainier book by D. Molinar. First published in 1791, this book graces the libraries of many Pacific Northwesterners, including mine. I'm sure some of you attending even have this book. It's a great book. And just like every mapping project needs to start with a data set, each book of historical accounts has to begin their timeline somewhere. In the chapter titled Discovery and First Explorations, Molinar begins the timeline at 1792, which, while it was a very long time ago, the mountain was certainly discovered prior to then. The Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Yakima, Nisqually, Cowlitz people, they definitely knew of Rainier prior to 1792. And this is the reason that I admire D. Molinar's honest tone when he acknowledges in this chapter that his accounts of exploration begin with the first white man in 1833. And this is an upfront declaration of bias. Acknowledging this is essential to understanding that this book is a record of explorations, but not the record. And likewise, our class project was a map of related incidents, but it could not be considered a complete spatial record. So in order to fill in some of those data gaps from the book, to get a more complete spatial record, I contacted Mike Gauthier, who was Mount Rainier National Park's lead climbing ranger at the time. And Mike was very receptive to the idea of our map. He saw it as a potential safety tool that could help Rainier hikers and climbers understand the risks of the mountain by learning about historical and recent accounts of those who have encountered hazards. Mike invited me to come to Rainier for about 5 weeks that summer to work on the map as a park employee. So I was very excited. And within my first week at Rainier, I was introduced to a climber who had recently lost their loved ones on the mountains just weeks prior. So here I was, a young GIS student, excited about living on Mount Rainier for the summer to build this really cool climbing themed map. And I was face to face with a person whose life was forever changed by the very thing that made this map possible. This moment transformed my approach to mapping forever. And I'm very grateful to this person's graciousness in sharing their story with me. And I'm thankful for this moment that it occurred during my first year as a map maker, because this moment exposed the responsibility to consider my data more carefully and to consider the impact of the maps I make. And with this new sense of responsibility, every choice about this map was motivated by something completely different than choices made prior. So the finished map was made with consideration for the lives that were impacted by the incidents. The points, lines, polygons, the imagery, and the text that we put on our maps represent and impact real cultures, real people, animals, plants, and their habitats and ecosystems, as do our motivations to make those maps. Bias in maps is inevitable, but awareness about our biases is not. We cannot always meet every group impacted by our map stories, and we cannot survey every species that may be impacted by our mapping projects, but we can acknowledge what our motivations are when we make maps and maybe even adjust them in the process. And in doing so, we can be empowered to build even better maps. So in our field, among us, when we talk about map bias, oftentimes in our geoprofessional circles, it is the map as artifact that is critiqued. So just like the term bias, I'm not using critique as positive or negative. I'm using it as a healthy inquiry of the map to identify what is included and why, and also what is not included from the map. And because of this tendency we have in geo to critique the artifact itself, a lot of the responsibility for bias is seen as sitting in the hands of the last person or group of persons who touch the map, the cartographers, at least in my experience, at least what we think of cartographers today. In second place for perceived responsibility is the people who asked for the map to be made. But what about before the map even exists and before someone even has the idea for a map? Analyses have to occur prior to map creation, and data have to exist prior to analyses. And without going into an entire tangent about this, which are in themselves very interesting topics under the umbrella of critical data studies, I'm going to instead summarize, and that is the biases of all parties who have influence on data collection, data models, analytical models. All the biases of all those data influencers and practitioners are imprinted on the map that eventually are created from those data analyses. So right now you may be thinking, and I've had these discussions a lot, so I'm assuming that some of you might be thinking, could be wrong, well, there are actually data sets that are unbiased. They simply represent where things are on the planet. And to you, I totally hear you, but just hear me out for a second. So let's consider how a geomorphologist might study our beautiful Pacific Northwest coastline. They do so usually typically at very large scales. First, let's just consider the geographic boundaries of the Pacific Northwest, where most of you consider yourselves a resident of. The boundaries for that are fuzzy, and it really depends on who you ask. So before I move on to the next slide, I'll let you all take a look at these maps and ask yourselves, is your home included in the Pacific Northwest on these maps? And do you think it should? Ask yourselves, which of these maps is the most correct map of the Pacific Northwest? Or if you could define the boundaries, where would they be? And would your boundaries match everyone else's at this conference? So since you are all a group of geospatial professionals and enthusiasts, most of you have probably heard of the coastline paradox, but I'm going to talk about it real quick. It's a good thing to remind ourselves of when considering the bias of geospatial data. So the coastline paradox occurs because the length of a coastline will differ depending on the length of a measuring stick. So imagine this red measuring stick that I'm showing here is 1 mile. The coastline measured here is then 9 miles long. But if we shorten the measuring stick to a 1/2 mile, the length of the coastline will increase. So in theory, we could measure a coastline with an infinitesimally small measuring stick, which means that the length of coastlines are theoretically infinite. So that's the paradox. A coastline that we know to be finite is infinitely long. And things like this can impact the bias of the analyses, the outcome of our maps. We can even use the biased intuitions of map readers to make our maps more effective. And I think that's really cool. So on my free time, I like to draw hillshade maps by hand. Here are some drawings that I've done. And a lot of GIS folks deal with raster data when they make hillshade, and mappers and scientists have discovered an effective way to play off our quick judgments to better serve readers with hillshade maps. So when we're walking around in our daily lives, we see the world illuminated from above. So we're accustomed to understanding objects with the light source at the top or above us. And because we intuitively understand the world this way, shaded relief maps are typically artificially illuminated from the upper left. And on most maps, that's the northwest of the map. And we even do this in the northern hemisphere shaded relief maps, even though the sun illuminates the southern slopes more here. I mean, this in this middle image, those pyramids, I mean, very starkly illuminated the light source from the upper left. And because of that, you can see this map and know that there's a crater feature in the middle. The illumination helps visualize that. But really, it's Mount St. Helens. It's a volcano in our region of the world. So this optical illusion that makes topography look inverse from reality is called relief inversion. And research has identified the best position to artificially illuminate shaded relief. So, I mean, here you can see the call out that upper left is the best, even based on this empirical study by Dr. Arzu Kolekin. Sorry about mispronouncing her name. And you can read her article here. It's a wonderful article that she permitted me to share in this presentation. So at the beginning of this talk, I asked you all to think of cartography as map making and consider map making as a holistic process. Fieldwork, data collection, data cleanup, analysis, and visualization are all necessary to produce a scientifically valid map. So now I'm going to spend a few moments discussing the line between GIS and cartography. Cartography is a term that has been around since the mid-19th century. But humans have been making maps for thousands of years. And as we humans do, with the professionalization of the field, we needed a name. So now we have the word cartography. GIS as a defined field is relatively new in comparison with cartography. And it's been around since about the 1960s, at least as a term. It's probably been around a little bit longer than that, but we understand GIS from the 1960s onward. And I also want to acknowledge here that there are even newer terms to define different ways we scientifically analyze things in geographical information systems. And the even newer term for this is geospatial, which isn't news to all of you since the majority of you work or study GIS and geospatial. But I just wanted to call that out because for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to consider GIS here to mean the work that we do in GIS and geospatial. So the North American Cartographic Information Society, or NACIS, held its annual conference last week, and I'm a regular NACIS attendee, as some of you might be in the audience. And the conference presentations are really wonderful. Presenters are typically cartographers, and although I haven't conducted a survey, I can say with at least some level of certainty that most of the presenters have either taken a few GIS classes or are fully trained in GIS. And I'm one of these people. I'm a certified GIS analyst, and I work for a wonderful company that makes GIS software. And I'm a cartographer. And when I make maps, there's no moment when I say, I'm now doing GIS or I'm now doing cartography. Because for me, it's all the same act of map making, just different parts of the process. However, with the advent of GIS, this wonderful tool, there are now a lot of people making a lot of powerful maps that are more concerned with the valuable findings, the predictions, and other analyses. So we now have these important spatial discoveries that have these amazing impacts on how we view the world. So this is my Maps for Adobe team back at the UC when we were convening in person. And because of this differentiation between GIS analyst and cartographer, I am very frequently presented with a map made by a GIS professional, and the first thing they say when they show me their map is they want some feedback, and they say, I'm not a cartographer. They want me to know that because they think that I'm going to judge their map's aesthetic. So here I am looking at a map that they made that communicates to me very significant spatial findings. So I always ask myself the question, what part of the map making process did this map maker not do that they think would have made them a cartographer? So remember, the common description of cartography is the science and art of map making. And I think a lot of these map makers who don't self-identify as a cartographer are focusing on the art side of this description. But for a moment, let's unpack this science side. Like I mentioned, there is the geoanalytical science that many of us cartographers perform when we make our maps. But this geoanalytical science, the data crunching, this is all performed by those talented map makers who don't think that they're cartographers. And then there is this data visualization part of the science. It's the science that informs the decisions for communicating the data clearly. And I've had the opportunity to focus on this data visualization part of the science a lot. It's very fun. This might be on the science side, what some folks feel they don't do to be considered cartographers. But in my experience, it's the art side that people are thinking of when they say they're a map maker, but they don't claim to be a cartographer. They're almost apologetic for their maps aesthetics. And to me, this is very unfortunate for a few reasons. I'm going to list two. Number one, it potentially reduces the idea of what cartography is to this final beautification of the map. So for those of you who do consider yourselves to be cartographers, you might, like me, consider cartography as a holistic process, where even if you are not collecting the data or performing some of the analyses, you're very aware of how those contribute to the value of your maps. And since we've tended to split GIS and cartography into separate entities, and for understandable reasons, many mapping projects either never bring on a cartographer or they wait until the very end of the mapping project. So as a cartographer, as myself, I'm going to admit that visual communication is paramount to those of us who claim to be cartographers. But if it's important for the mapping project to be viewed by an audience other than the people involved with the project, then visual communication needs to be considered at the data collection phase or even earlier as the project is being outlined. And that's why I like to think of the whole process under the term map making. And the second reason that considering cartography is only the artistic side is that it leads us to think that a map has to reach a certain beauty level in order to be taken seriously as cartography. And both of these points are an entire presentation in themselves, and I really enjoy talking about this. So if you want to continue the conversation, please reach out to me. I love having these cartography conversations. But for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the amazing power of maps, which is no doubt why we are drawn to this field. So at the beginning of this talk, when I asked you to consider cartography very broadly as the contextualization of space for ours and others' understanding of this space, so far I've covered basically map making involves bias, and this is neither inherently good nor bad. And number two, we need to break down our assumptions about what is cartography or map making and who can do it. As map makers, we are essentially participating in a spatial dialogue because we're iterating and reiterating who or what exists where and what they do and what they exist for. And that's powerful. That also means there's a lot at stake in the work that we do. So I want to finish with an example of how we can be empowered to make maps that address bias in map making. This is cartographer Amber Boss. She researches participatory mapping. Participatory mapping is when local communities make maps that tell their own stories rather than hoping that traditional cartographers are going to capture the stories. And the entire reason why participatory mapping exists is because maps have been used as tools of power for a very long time. Because maps are so powerful, they can help dictate how resources are allocated. And they can also be used to help empower communities, fight climate change, and countless other ways to help better our world. And today, many people are claiming the act of map making to define their community spaces for policies that serve everyone better. So I got the chance to interview Amber about one of her participatory mapping projects. Amber worked with the residents of a region in Atlanta, Georgia. And these residents became the data collectors, the analysts, and the map makers of the projects. So these map makers presented their maps to their mayor, and actual change occurred for their community due to their map making efforts. These community built maps have become powerful tools for enacting impactful policies. So are participatory maps going to win a cartography competition? Maybe, maybe not. But I think it's far more impactful to enact useful policy than to make a pretty map. And if you're curious about reading more about Dr. Boss's project, here's an article that she wrote and published in the Professional Geographer. So when I hear stories like this, like Amber's and her work, it benefits me as a professional cartographer. First, it is a stark reminder to include, or at least consider, the many who may be impacted by my maps. And second, I think it's a great lesson in taking the time to pay attention to the stories behind maps. In other words, examples like these give us inspiration for strategies for leveraging bias in map making and challenging our assumptions for who can do cartographic work. Now, I asked you all to consider a very broad definition of cartography. I also challenged the stark line between GIS and cartography. And this was to get us all thinking about how, no matter where you fall in our wonderful geospatial profession, we are all ultimately giving spatial context to the world we live in to hopefully make the world a better place. However, I do actually recognize the many different subfields in geospatial, and that each of these subfields requires skills that make us experts in whatever subfield we have chosen. My particular area of focus is cartography and data viz, and that does require honing in on certain skills. Some of you might fall under that umbrella as well, and others of you fall under other areas of expertise, which may or may not be listed here. But regardless of what those areas of expertise are, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that you all are the experts in this powerful act that we call map making. So as the experts, what can we do to use our skills to continue to make powerful maps? Well, the first thing to do is address bias, acknowledge it. Remember, if we try to represent all the things that exist within the extent of our maps would never be legible. They wouldn't be clear. In fact, the skill to decide what goes on a map and what does not is what makes great maps. This skill is what allows spatial stories to be told so well. We have to know what to include to tell these stories to better understand our world. Another way is to address bias is to ask who or what the map is serving. We all want to know our map audience, but then ask who or what the map isn't serving. Not who it's harming, but who isn't reflected. Remember my Wenatchee Marathon maps? By knowing that the map doesn't serve as a navigation route from the Wenatchee Safeway to the Wenatchee YMCA, I can understand what to omit from my map. Also, I live in Bellingham. Let's say we were getting a potential light rail route. I don't have any news that we are, but if I'm making a map for a potential light rail route in Bellingham, the map serves commuters. But depending on where the light rail goes, it can potentially have impacts on wetlands and the species that live in them. Potentially, just an example. It doesn't mean the map shouldn't be made, but it can give us a richer understanding of the cartography that we are creating. And third is just to understand that map making is a holistic process. And finally, as the experts, the best thing you can do is to continue to make maps. It's very necessary. So finally, before I go, if you wanted to do a screenshot or an image of this, I wanted to share a list of resources with you all on mapping uncertainty, participatory mapping, and overcoming spatial bias with GIS. So each of these are pieces written or videos made by folks at Esri, and they're fabulous resources. And the two underlined are videos. Just wanted to point that out if you want to watch videos. And I'll give you a moment to capture this if you wanted to. And that concludes my talk. I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share conversations about the power of map making. I've really enjoyed getting the chance to talk with you all. And if there's questions, I can take them now. And also, if anybody wants to continue this conversation, I can be reached at Sarah Bell Maps.
Awesome, thank you, Sarah. We do have two questions over in the Whova app, so I'll read them in the order they came in and let you go. So the first is from Kara Utter, and please forgive me if I said your name wrong, Kara. It says, how was the animated map made that shows the routes moving in the red color over the dark base map?
Oh, wow. Okay. I'd love to answer that. Am I answering chat in Zoom or Whova?
That was a QA in Whova.
Okay, cool. That's a great question. So that was made with, we basically mapped to the HTML canvas. We used Esri's JS API, and we calculated Bezier curves from the start point to the end point. And I wanted to paste something in the chat because it's a open source free sort of HTML layer we created that you can modify if you want. Rather than look it up, I'll do that later. But yeah, that was a great question.
Awesome. We have one more that I'm seeing over in the Whova app here. It's from Richard Daniels, and it says, if we did the shade direction analysis from only people in South America who are not college educated, would we get the same results?
That's a good question. I think so, because I think in that empirical study that I shared by Dr. Arzu, they just used a general audience. I don't know if they were in South America or not, but I do know that they weren't considered cartographers or map experts. But that's a great question.
We have a question from Sephi Fox, and Sephi, if that's not how you say your name, I'm sorry. You can message me later, but she says, can you show that slide with the links again?
Oh yeah.
And then while you're doing that, I will flip over to Mike Miller, who had a question, and he said, you mentioned a mapping book with tutorials early in your presentation. Right. How can I acquire this book?
That is a great question as well. It's a book that is now available. Well, I think that there are 3 copies of the book being handed out as prizes for this conference. I'm trying to find the share and talk this through at the same time. Sharing screen. Here's the links. And then also on anywhere where you can buy a book online, you can buy it through Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Right now it's available in ebook format. And on January 6th, you can order it. You can pre-order now, but you can order it by January 6th. It will be available in hard copy. And it's a book on ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. It's a plugin for Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. And we even have now, you can use it in conjunction with ArcGIS Pro. And if you go to esriurl.com/Sarah Bell, I write a bunch of tutorials for getting started with ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. I'll put that in the chat too, so you can see that. esriurl.com/Sarah Bell. And that has tons of tutorials on ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud.
Perfect. I don't see any other questions coming in. I'm just checking real quick to make sure we didn't miss anybody. Does not look for it. Jim Glassley says, shout out to Western Washington University Geography.
That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I just wanted to say one last thank you, and thank you, Randy, for this invitation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. It was wonderful. I think everybody really enjoyed it. If you guys have any more questions for Sarah, she may be around in Whova from time to time, but if not, she is active on her Twitter and very nice. So you should be able to get a hold of her. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah.